Alrighty, I think we're live, and I'm not sure if that played the bumper or not. So,
all right. Here we go.
The number of technical and logistical difficulties that I have had on a normal, sunny Friday morning are off the freaking charts right now. So, we're not going to talk about where I'm sitting. We're not going to talk about why I sound like this. We're not going to talk about the lighting. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about your questions, everybody. Please, for the love of God, let's get to the questions. I've been trying to get set up to do this for the last 2.5 hours. So, anyways, Scott's here. Hey, Scott, how's it going?
Hey, good. I have this UI hotline.
Hotline. We now officially have a real number. Look, we don't even have the banner. We don't even have the banner scrolling around here. I'm such a mess this morning. Oh my goodness. There we go. Hey, there we go.
We're official now.
So we'll work it in as we go. We now officially have a real hotline number. Scott has a real phone next to him. It is a real working telephone number. So if you yearn for the nostalgia of a time gone past and you want to call us on the phone, then you can literally call a real number. You can leave a message. Yep. And if it's funny, we'll read it out loud on the stream. And if it's a question, we'll answer it on stream, and we can go from there.
Actually, producer Dustin is telling me that they can actually take the record. He has the recording of the voicemail, and we can play it live on the air, and we can answer it.
Watch out, Dave Ramsey. Here we go.
Well, let me edit this banner at the bottom while you talk about your week, your month in review, Scott. And then if anybody wants to be the guinea pig, then we can have them call the number live, because boy, does it feel live right now. So, Scott, how's it going? We just did a massive webinar yesterday on the rule. You've been traveling around. What's been going on?
Yeah, last week I wasn't able to be here for the Q&A. I was traveling. I was actually up, up at Army football game. So, doing that whole thing this year. They're having a great season, so that's been a lot of fun. Next week, I'm actually going to be in DC. Really looking forward to that. Going to the NDIA cybersecurity, meeting that they're having there in Arlington. So that should be interesting. Stacy Bosjanic will be speaking at that, among a number of other people. So looking forward to hearing what Stacy has to say, and, potentially bringing some takeaways, from that for next time we're able to get together. So that's what I'll be doing next week. And if anybody wants to catch up while I'm there in DC, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to, grab a coffee or a drink or what have you, and sit down and talk CMMC and CUI. It's the favorite topic of the day, right?
It is. Awesome. Favorite topic.
Absolutely. Any takeaways yesterday from the webinar that we did? We did our big Summit 7 webinar on the 32 CFR rule. There were like 1,000 people on that webinar. We had 1,000 people on the webinar back in January. I mean, just thoughts, perspective on that in general, now that we've had a night to
it was great. I enjoyed it. You, as always, did a wonderful job, putting the slides together and all of that. So I got to play peanut gallery, which is always fun. But really what I would take away from it is, one, the number of questions that were asked. We just simply could not get to anywhere close to the number of questions that were asked. I want to say that it was in the hundreds of questions that were, either through the chat or actually through the Q&A. We pulled some of those that we're going to actually, I think, talk about today, which is great. What really struck me about the questions, though, and we advertised the webinar as this, but, a lot of the questions were, in many cases, beginner level questions. So there's a lot of people that are just starting to get in, and start to understand and realize what the requirements are and what they have to do and those kinds of things. And so there were a lot of questions that were, questions that we honestly have been answering, for years at this point, which is fine. That means that, more people are paying attention, more people are getting involved, and starting to do the right things and do the things the right way, and want to do things the right way, which is really the most important thing of all.
Yeah. I said it on the webinar yesterday. I had a bunch of people message me before the webinar, as I typically do. And the overwhelming number one thing that people said was, is this webinar a good fit for me if I know nothing about CMMC? So, we've been talking about CMMC for years, but like we've talked about on the stream, we've talked about it CS2. There's more people don't know what it is than actually know what it is, including people who are directly affected by it. So I'm glad we were able to put that out there, and we'll have lots more content. We'll eventually get to everybody's questions. If your question from the webinar yesterday is particularly burning, call the hotline number.
It's a real number.
And
it's real.
If we could get it to set up and Dustin's available, then we could have it played out. All right, Daniel, let's see. What are you thinking about this week?
Man, so after our 32 CFR webinar that both of you did, which was incredible, by the way, I just skipped over to our good friends at DAU and looked at their CMMC webinar, which is pretty interesting. So ironically enough, this PowerPoint slide is marked CUI, even though it was in a public presentation that was given.
We got you, everybody.
Yep, we got you. So, so this is a screenshot from that presentation. Encode is the Army solution, basically a virtual desktop enclave that they're pitching to what I would call save small business, right? And they've got a associated timeline with when they're expecting that to roll out. And, you know, a lot of people were very excited in the chat. However, there were a lot of questions, right? Can this connect on-prem to my systems? What do I do with my specialized line of business applications? What do I do with my intellectual property that isn't CUI? Like, is the Army going to have that? You know, what happens? All those different use cases, right? And the Army, in good fashion, said, hey, we're considering all these questions. Like, we don't have any answers to all of them yet. But they're painting this solution as a, you know, again, a savior to small business, right? I mean, they estimated the cost somewhere around, with the assessment, right at about $150,000 for a 10-person enclave. Is what they anticipated for the private sector, or I'm sorry, for like a regular small business to have to spend. On the right-hand side, you see the estimated cost of what Encode would look to actually cost. The problem is it's not exactly the best all-in fit. Even they said, hey, this is about an 80% solution that we can provide you guys. There's still a lot of CMMC you have to do, assuming it's a perfect fit out of the box, which for very few companies, as we know, is just not going to be a great fit out of the box. It's an enhanced version of DoD Safe, in my opinion. Although great and some more functionality in a virtualized environment, it just doesn't bring into scope on-prem systems, printing, plotting, you know, things that people have to do to physically have their hands on CUI to get the job done. But it was very interesting. I applaud the Army for taking this and running with it and trying to help small business. I think they're doing a great and putting forth a great effort in doing this. Their rollout schedule is kind of contradicts the CMMC rollout schedule, though, right? So how many people are going to wait on a hopeful good solution from the Army with Encode when CMMC, the prime, might be asking them as early as now to January to February to be ready to get certified, right? And if you look at this timeline, and we're looking out fiscal year 2026, right, to even be able to onboard, you know, thousands of people, right, at scale. So anyways, this was my big takeaway is Encode, great. Like, I love the thought behind it. I love what the Army's trying to do to save small business. I don't think it's a surefire fit for most people from a holistic CMMC data flow approach. But it's really interesting to see the DoD and the Army in particular trying to do something to help. So
yeah, for sure. And so I'm going to be very mindful of my frustrations with my technical difficulties this morning. I'm not going to allow that to color my comments here about Encode. However, as you were showing us some of the slides from the webinar yesterday, I am struck by the case that the Army paints around the inability of their supply chain to meet the requirements for a variety of factors, and the odd timing of them now offering a solution only after the CMMC rule has become final, right? Why are we waiting to help people who need help with the requirements until CMMC is a thing? This is exactly the same problem that I have with the NSA CCC Center, which they really are not a fan of the criticism. And I think it's a fair criticism. They'll go around to these events. They'll have these webinars saying, we'll offer you help with requirements in 800-171, but they pin it to the rollout of CMMC. Those are existing requirements that people need help with. Why did we wait? Because to your point, the rollout is now going to happen well before the fully operational system for ENCODE is theoretically available, barring budgets, barring staffing, barring priority differences, government shutdowns. There's a bunch of variables that could happen here. And so I'm glad overall that there are things like this trying to be cooked up, but we've heard the idea from DoD for a long time that these things would be coming. And it's just very frustrating to me that they all just waited for CMMC to be a problem while they were, urging people to go get ready. But to your point, there are limitations to this solution, and they didn't exactly seem very good at explaining what the trade-offs are. And if this were a private company that were making those claims, they would get trashed on Reddit and Discord for not telling the whole story. And so I'm glad that the DoD and the services are trying here, but there's a lot of room for improvement here, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And hey, if you're open to feedback, we're obviously willing to give it. So if there's anybody from the Army listening in, feel free to reach out to us. But one last kind of note on this, $90,000 implementation costs on average for CMMC level 2. That should really say DFARS 7012. Back to your point, Jacob, it's like, why are we waiting to put a dollar figure on that? And you're basically, all of these small businesses, you're basically acknowledging that they haven't been compliant since 2016, 2017, by now offering them an environment that is compliant, because a lot of them haven't done the work, and they know that, right? So they're trying to skirt around that particular conversation and just push it all on CMMC. But anyways, that's my weekend review, a little spicy meatball for you. Jacob, what about you, man? What's your weekend review?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure that won't be the last time we talk about ENCODE by means here. So, all right. So what I just want everybody to be aware of is 800-172 revision cycle will be kicking off probably next week. Ron Ross has gone on the record to say it'll be before Thanksgiving.
Ooh.
It clearly wasn't going to be the week of the election, so that leaves either next week or the week after. So sometime in the next 2 weeks, we will see the initial public draft of the basically first revision ever to NIST SP 800-172. This is relevant to everybody because if you are expecting CMMC level 3 requirements, then this will be the set of requirements that you will be assessed against in the future revision to CMMC once that's done. As we talked about in the webinar yesterday, what seems like a very boring part of the rule, the incorporation by reference part of the rule, is very important because it's essentially a regulated bibliography. And when those references in this bibliography, if you will, are revised, that is the trigger for new rulemaking. And so since 800-171 revision 2 and the original version of 800-172 are incorporated by reference, when those are revised, we're going to get another round of CMMC rulemaking.
So what do you think? I mean, do you think that we're going to start, with a new rulemaking in second half of 25? I mean, do you think they'll start it as soon as 48's done?
I think there's, I think they're going to start sooner than second half for sure.
Really?
And so,
wow. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think that, probably earlier in 2025, I mean, they may wait until 172. I'm not exactly sure, how they make that decision, but it will happen. It will happen for sure. Now, that isn't to say that the work that you put in currently to comply with CMMC isn't valuable or doesn't get you very far. Because as we've talked about, the delta between these standards is a lot smaller when you go from one revision to the next than it is to go from nothing to the new revision. Yeah. It's a much larger jump. But Ron Ross has said that the 172 formatting will be much closer to 853. That is the direction that they're moving with. Still here? Am I still here? Boy, we are hanging out by a thread with this Wi-Fi.
Little tightrope walking over there.
I'm giving too much information away about the rulemaking process. Cutting the lines. The nice thing about 172 is that it is an indicator of the way that 171 formatting will look in the future. So that's what people should think about, is that even if it doesn't directly affect you, they define ODPs in 172, which means that in the future, they're going to define ODPs for 171. They format 172 closer to 853, which means in the future, 171 will look like 853. So even if you don't have to implement those requirements directly, it's still interesting and useful to pay attention to, because that's sort of painting the picture of the way that most people under the thumb of CMMC are going to move in the future.
So question for you, Jacob. let's say DoD kicks off, updates to CMMC early next year. Is that a 2-year process, a 1-year process? A revision of the DFARS, the 32 CFR and then DFARS 7021, which I doubt there'd be a 7021 update. Like, is that a 6-month process? Is that a 12? Like, when would people expect to have these new NIST requirements potentially revved into CMMC?
Yeah, I would say that the new round of rulemaking would be shorter than the last round of rulemaking, because revising things doesn't take as long as creating things. But how that would work, I would imagine if you're at you can imagine if you're at the very tail end of a rollout, or if you're still in line at the very end of, a couple years from now,
Sure.
There's an increased chance that you would get caught up in the revision of getting the new stuff as the requirement, rather than being able to get your certification done and then being basically insulated from changes for up to 3 years. So we don't know exactly when it will happen. We'll have to see when the revision to 172 is done and when the rulemaking process kicks off for the next one. They typically announce that in the Federal Register, so we'll have a general frame of reference. But like we've talked about, it pays to go sooner rather than later, because it just gets more expensive. There's more risk. There's also now more risk that you're going to get caught up with larger baselines if you wait longer. So there's a lot of reasons to try to go faster than wait.
So, a question to extend on top of that, Jacob. And then we probably need to get into some questions, some caller questions.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. But let's say, we're talking about these revision cycles, right? And let's say we get a CMMC certification in June of 2025. All right. That means that by the way the rule's set up, we are good through May of 2028, right? Well, let's say at the same time, DoD decides to revise the rule to bring the R3 requirements into scope. And that process is completed in December of 26. All right. So we have 18 months left in our certification window, with our existing certification. And we get a new contract in January of 27. Okay. So we're 18 months out, roughly. Do we have to now, do our self-assessments now have to be against the new baseline? Or do our self-assessments continue against our CMMC R2 baselines, or NIST 171 R2 baselines?
Yeah, it'll be dependent on how they juggle the new requirements and the old requirements via class deviations. It'll depend on what they're looking for in terms of priority. There's a lot of it's impossible to predict, but there's a lot of ways that it could play out. So make sure you tune in every week, everybody, because it's not exactly a straightforward story. So alrighty, let's see here. Let's get through it. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see here. All right. So Evan said, "Hey, it's the best hour of the week."
Hey, Evan.
Hey, we're glad to see you. Glad to see you. So he also said, any insight into when we might expect version 2.0 of the CMMC assessment process document, the CAP?
Yeah.
So
we got, a month to go, right? I mean,
yeah, basically.
Gotta have it.
Right,
gotta have it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I've heard in speaking with some of the C3PAO folks who've been in the working group working on the document that it exists. They have positive signs of life from the document. It has been a thing that has been in development. As they talked about on the town hall a couple of days ago, they basically have to get all of their ducks in a row by the 16th of December for the commercial launch based on the effective date of the final rule. So sometime between now and then, hopefully sooner rather than later, but no later than December 16th-ish. So definitely before the end of the year. I hope that they have it out maybe before the next town hall. That would be nice if we could see that before the town hall, but it'll definitely be before the end of the year based off of everything that I've heard.
If anybody is watching that's working on that, is on that working group, everyone I talk to these days is like, for the love of God, please have some reference of what relevant SPA controls are. Everyone is freaking out about what do people interpret as relevant. And if that's left up on a per assessor basis, I think it's going to get really challenging.
I think I think we had that question yesterday. I don't know, at least 8 to 10 times in the questions yesterday. So that is certainly something. Yeah. What do you think, Jacob?
I think you're not going to get an answer. I think that I think you might get more clarity, as they say, but I would not bet that you're going to get an answer. And so this is something that we talk about with our friend Ryan Bonner at DefCert very, very often, is that you're not going to get clear and definitive implementation answers from the government. So you're not going to get clear and definitive answers around interpretations about relative implementations either. The way that it ought to work, and I know that this is a privileged position because not a lot of people have the resources, but the way that the conversation should work with your assessor is that they are there checking the answers that you gave yourself to prove that these things are implemented, verified, applicable, not applicable, so on and so forth. And so really it should be a formality checking that you did the process that you would otherwise do. If you stop and you say, hey, assessor, what do you think the answer should be? Then you're going to get a bunch of different interpretations because there is no specific implementation guidance. That is a big advantage for companies who know what they're doing, because you can basically corner your assessors into verifying the things that you have verified yourself the way that you have verified them. It's a huge disadvantage for companies that don't know what they're doing, because you're effectively just asking, on what, based on what they had for lunch that day. You don't know what the interpretation is going to be. And so this is why it's so important to work with the right partners, because, the conversation is a much more one-way conversation with the assessors rather than it is sort of like asking for help from the assessors. Because if you get an answer from the assessor that's different from your implementations at assessment time, you probably won't be able to fix it if it's a big issue, and then you're really out of luck. So,
well, this is, this is also, one of those cases where it's really a big help to the the OSA, the OSC, if the external service provider they're using is certified, right?
Yep.
Because then, all of it's taken care of, and you don't have to worry about, is this control in scope or is this control not in scope? All the controls are taken care of because that assessor or that ESP has completely, validated and verified that third party. And so, so you don't have to worry about the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, it's part of the reason why I think that the DoD in the rule is like, hey, most of these companies in the div are small businesses. So most of these companies are going to be using managed service providers.
Yeah.
It's why they include the language. It's why they include the treatment. It's why it's such an important decision. It's why they estimate costs to include, MSP support during your assessment. So, partnering with an MSP who has, I don't know, former DIBCAC auditors on the staff might be a good idea. Partnering with an MSP that has more CCPs and CCAs on staff than the average C3PAO does might be a decent idea. Or an MSP that's already run more than a dozen companies through the JSVA process with perfect scores, which is probably a good way to have an outside indicator that they know what they're doing. And that's us. I'm talking about us, right? That's exactly what we did. That's exactly the structure of, that's why we sent, Scott, if I am understanding correctly, that's why we made the decision to send pretty much the entire technical staff of Summit 7 through CCP training.
Yeah. People have said that, people have called me risk averse, and in these kinds of things, I very much am, right? I don't want to go into I don't ever want to go into an assessment or an audit and not know the answer or know the outcome before the assessor ever shows up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, if I'm going to have something, being assessed for me, I'm going to do everything I can to stack that deck and ensure that I don't have a problem at the end of the day. So it's, some people say that, that's not a great thing because, it causes more work or what have you. But, I don't like adding risk in those areas. There's so many other areas where you can't avoid risk. I like to minimize risk everywhere I possibly can.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So Alexander says, if vulnerability scans are the only CUI your company transmits as the subcontractor to the prime, can you reasonably self-assess at level 2? This is a heck of a question here because technically vulnerability scans themselves are not controlled and classified information.
As long as they're not for federal agencies. So they could be doing some work there, but
yeah, for the most part, and I would say 9 out of 10 times, right? Your vulnerability scans are not going to be CUI, so that is not going to be looping you into the requirements. unless you're on some sort of a subcontract here, maybe you can add some more details in the chat if you're still around, Alexander, about maybe why that vulnerability scan data in your situation would be CUI. So let's say that you're a subcontractor and you're not dealing with CUI between you and the prime. Could you reasonably self-assess at level 2? If there's no CUI involved in that interaction at all, and it's just FCI, you technically don't need level 2 at any status.
So let's back it down a level and say it's not CU, but it's SPD. Let's say it's SPD, because that's really what I think he's talking about here. Is security protection data.
Well, if you're dealing with security protection data between you and your prime contractor, that's not CUI. So you wouldn't necessarily need level 2. Now your prime might be doing the thing that a lot of the primes are doing, where they're saying, we need you to get level 2 anyways. Now you might be able to negotiate with them to say, well, it's not technically CUI, but you guys want us to be level 2. So can we self-assess, or do we still need to be a C3PAO third-party assessment? But there seems to be a little bit of wiggle room here, because if it's security protection data, you don't actually need that level 2 assessment. Assuming you're a standard sort of defense subcontractor business here, you're not an MSP, you're not doing that kind of work.
It looks like he followed up here and said that the vulnerability scans were labeled as CUI, so they must be vulnerability scans of government systems. Is the
or it could be that, and it's legitimate CUI. It could be an overmarking problem too.
Like we just saw with our encode presentation.
Exactly, yes. They could be saying that it's CUI. Now in the rule, right, for example, in the rule, the DoD's opinion is that aggregated data in SPRS regarding vulnerabilities is CUI. They actually just say that straight up, but that doesn't tend to affect subcontractors. So you could have an overmarking situation, which you could potentially get them to undo, but your mileage may vary. You could have a situation where they're just sort of high watermarking and saying everybody's going to need level 2. Technically, there are arguments you could make to get out of needing level 2 at all. There are arguments you could make to get out of needing an external C3PAO level 2. So I would say maybe dig in a little bit more, but there is a case to be made that you could do this.
Now, to follow up on that, Jacob, and we've said this a few times on the live stream here, a certification requirement, a sub doesn't get to make that selection, right? If you actually do have CUI and you can't, they can't unmark it or decontrol it, or maybe it's not actually CUI and it's just overmarked, then you're going to have to inherit the requirements from the prime, whatever the contracting officer there is telling you have to be as a requirement of the solicitation. Is that
if the data flows, right?
If the data is coming down or up as CUI, then your prime will tell you what level you're going to have to be at, assuming it actually is CUI.
Yeah, it's based on the requirement that's in the contract to the prime. If the DoD says the nature of the data involved with this contract will require a C3PAO CMMC status, an external assessment with a C3PAO for you, then any subcontractor that receives CUI downstream from that contract will also need a C3PAO agreement, which is why the odds of being able to self-assess are pretty low. But there are people who make the cases for this. It all depends on your relationship with your customer, your specifics. So hopefully that helped, Alexander. Reasonably, could you? Sure. Is it likely? Maybe not. No. All right. People were talking about the webinar was great. Thanks so much. Ms. Adkins said the webinar was excellent. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll try to get to everybody's questions like we were talking about beforehand. Okay. Somebody said, hello. I hope you're able to discuss cloud service providers with no CUI, but with security protection data, no FedRAMP, and the customer responsibility matrix and FedRAMP system security plan. Man, that is a lot of acronyms, Daniel.
That's a lot.
You want to help people unpack this a little bit?
Yeah. So the way that it's written today is that you would not, if you're a CSP and it's security protection data only, not in a CUI space. So like if it's not CUI with SPD, if it's just standalone SPD, then you don't have to be FedRAMP. You just don't have to do it anymore, right? That was the requirement from the proposed rule, that you had to be FedRAMP moderate or moderate equivalent in order to be able to hold that security protection data. The DoD said, hey, we're going to give you guys a break. We're going to repeal that requirement. But now what has to happen is that you have to have this client responsibility matrix, or what we refer to as a shared responsibility matrix, of the controls that you're providing to your client base, right? So again, it kind of goes into security protection data is only there for security protection assets. So we're assuming you're providing a security service, and the relevant controls that you're providing to that client base as part of that, right? So now we're kind of going back up to the SPA requirements for assessment. So when you're looking at your client responsibility matrix or shared responsibility matrix, there needs to be an alignment of the controls and the responsibility that you're taking on. So as a security tool, you might take on, maybe it's a virtual network appliance, maybe it's a SIM tool, maybe it's an EDR tool. Those types of control families is where you would need to show your responsibility. Down to the assessment objective level, please. Don't just rattle off the 110. Go all the way to the 320, my friends.
And you have to evaluate what relevant means. Right?
Well, yeah. What is this relevant word?
and you have to come to an agreement with your CSP on what you believe relevant means, and ensure that that lines up with what they believe relevant is. And if you disagree, then you got to figure that out.
Yeah, they're very not likely to have one control map to rule them all, unless the provider's just like take it or leave it, right? So
it's an interesting policy situation, because for something to be a category of CUI, there has to be a relevant authority on the books that says some kind of unclassified data requires protection. That's essentially what the NARA CUI registry is it's just a database of all of the authorities, the statutes that are on the books, the regulations that are on the books, government-wide policies that are on the books, that somehow say there's this data that we handle or that contractors handle that needs to be protected. We ended up with 800-171 because a lot of times protected was never defined, and they had to come up with a minimum baseline. So when the proposed rule came out and they said, hey, when you're dealing with this security protection data, you need to protect it, and that was being created by a regulation, I was like, oh, DoD is really flexing the way that the system is supposed to work here. They're creating a new category of CUI, which they can do. They're issuing a regulation. However, when you read through the 47% of the rule that is just comment responses and summaries, they talk about how the changes in the rule are really done so that there's nothing new on top of the requirements. Like in the future, I could see them saying SPD is a formal category of CUI by saying it in the regulation. But here they were like, no MSP certs, no SPD is a category of controlled unclassified information, no this, no that. Anything that would ostensibly be new outside of CMMC level 3 requirements, they were like, we're going to save that for the future. So I would imagine that SPD in the future will be a formal category of CUI, but they didn't do it this time around. So, all righty, let's see here. So Ms. Adkins said, it would be great if you could explain how contractors can post a level 2 SPRS score while still being in the 6-month POAM curing stage. My understanding is that for 5 and 3-point controls, you cannot give your company credit for the 5 and 3-pointers if they are still in the POAM phase. So that is correct. So the allowable requirements that can go on a plan of action and milestones after your assessment is very small. So your baseline score has to be at least 80% of the implementation. And the only requirements that are allowed to be on a POAM are the 1-point controls. And there are even some 1-point controls that they specify in the rule that are never allowed to be on the POAM. So you have a very narrow amount of controls that could possibly be on the POAM. So there's 2 different sort of things going on here. Currently and in the future, DoD contractors have to upload their scores to SPRS to comply with their current DFARS contract requirements. Currently, you calculate that score through DIBCAC's awesome access database tool, or maybe the updated Project Spectrum scoring tools and things like that. You would upload that score. You just don't get the points if you don't have the 5 and 3 point controls implemented or the relevant 1 point controls. You get a 50 or a negative 180 or whatever the score happens to be. CMMC goes up and running, and everything ends up filtering into SPRS the same way. So my understanding is that for 5 and 3 point controls, you cannot give your company credit. Yeah. So you wouldn't get credit in SPRS under CMMC for the 5 and 3 point controls, but you also wouldn't have a conditional CMMC status either. If you have the 5 and 3 point controls unimplemented, you don't pass. So you wouldn't have that underneath CMMC. So hopefully that helped clarify a little bit.
Let me ask you a follow-up there, because FIPS is definitely one of the contested controls, right? Where it's, I don't have it fully implemented, right? It's a 5 or a 3. Where would that fit in an example similar to what she's playing out?
So there's some specific language in the rule. I don't want to misquote it, so maybe we can park it for next week, but there's specific language in the rule for credit for partial implementations for FIPS and for multi-factor authentication. So they did carve that out as an exception. They talk about it extensively in their comment responses, that they know that there's a constraint around FIPS. They've tried to make a workaround around FIPS as much as they can. So there is a way to, work the scores and your conditional statuses along with the FIPS and MFA partial implementations. But I was actually thinking about this yesterday. Things were a lot simpler when DoD said no POAMs, because then the only rule is you just got to implement it or not. And now I was really thinking about this yesterday morning, Scott, before the webinar, as I was aggressively cutting slides out of the slide deck to try to keep it under an hour, where I was like, man, when you allow POAMs, now you have to explain the intricacies of how POAMs work. Now that you have a scoring system, you have to explain the intricacies of how the scoring system works. Now that you have partial implementations, you have to explain the intricacies of how partial points work. When it was no POAMs, there was nothing to explain. It was you implement it or you don't. So that was just an observation that I had yesterday.
Yeah.
The more they build features in to make it easier to do,
more complex,
the more things there are to understand and edge cases to explain.
And it's important to realize or remember that based on the rule as it sits, SPRS, you need to report that score regardless of what it is, right? If it is a negative 105, you need to report and submit to SPRS a negative 105 until you implement all those controls.
Yes.
Don't wait until you have a passing score to submit your SPRS. That is bad, right? They want the scores in SPRS regardless of how bad they are. Just make sure they're accurate. Don't just arbitrarily go in and put a 110 just because you're trying to check a box.
That's exactly it. I can't tell you how many people have done that.
That will get
and the faulty score upload thing is exactly what DOJ has been going after universities about recently, and based off what we've heard, that's exactly what they've been going after private companies on as well. It's been interesting with I know there's a little bit of a tangent, it wasn't in the comments, but there's the Georgia Tech thing, there's the Penn State thing, so on and so forth. And part of the motion to dismiss that came out maybe a week or two ago with Georgia Tech was they said, hey, whoa. You said that we didn't have an SSP, but our contract was imposing the version of 800.171 that originally didn't have an SSP requirement in it. So we're good to go, right? And that's a completely separate issue from whether you uploaded a score that is not accurate to what your control environment actually is. So do not upload an arbitrary score. Do not do that.
Uploading an incorrect score is a false claim.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And it's the hit list. I mean, we talked to, was it John Ellis back in the day, and they're like, we don't go after people with negative scores. We know that they're reporting correctly. We go after people with perfect scores. It's our hit list.
Right.
So then let's see. So she followed up here. She said, so should a contractor not enter an SPRS score for self-assessment unless they have an 88? So if this depends on the current situation, is your SPRS score needs to be uploaded regardless of what the score is. As far as uploading your self-assessment on the CMMC side, your minimum score is what dictates whether you have conditional or final status. I want to look in the detailed SPRS guidance documents to see where that works. I don't know if it is a blank fill in the blank score or if it says you've passed or not based on the score, But definitely check that out, because if it's a you pass or you're conditional, I would imagine that that could be interpreted to say if you just click we pass or we clicked conditional and the proof is not doesn't line up with that, then they would treat that the same as uploading a faulty score, which, as we talked about in the webinar yesterday, whatever case you make, whatever score you upload, conditional first, then you close out your POAM, final first because we had a perfect score, the rule is going to make you hold on to your assessment artifacts for 6 years per the DOJ's input into the rule. So we'd have to maybe dig in. I've heard that the SPRS interface is being updated or has been updated, so I'm not exactly sure how that field for the score works in there, but we'll dig into that some more and maybe talk about it next week. Maybe just a couple other here on this side. So for contractors whose primes are asking for SPRS scores, what strategies can they use to show the prime that they are working on compliance if they're not at the minimum passing score in the CMMC rule so far? Daniel, you hear from companies all the time here and from primes, right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, what we're getting asked for more and more, not us, but we're hearing our prospects when they come to us is like, help, I need to prove to my prime that I'm working on this, or I need to prove directly to the military, to the DOD, to the Army, to somebody that I'm actually doing this. Scott and I have been working with a particular prospect kind of in the queue here, and they have a requirement and they're withholding contract award until they see a established plan. So what that really means is they want an actionable POAM. They want to see that you're, potentially under contract with third-party vendors to get compliant, third-party partners, what the timeline looks like, big milestone dates. I mean, they want to see a real, basically, project plan for you getting compliant by a certain timeline.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the specific question that she's asking here, how do primes lose confidence in contractors who have a negative score? Yeah, I mean, there's going to be some confidence there, right? But if they're a subcontractor they want to work with, be honest, tell them what the score is, give them a POAM with an actionable POAM with actual dates, with actual plans that says this is how I am going to work off, and I'm going to go from a negative 110 to a negative 50,
203 or 50,
to a positive 75 in the next 6 months, and then the 6 months after that I'm going to go from a 75 to 104, and then in 9 months I'm going to be at 110. I mean, give them the plan, show them how you're going to get there, and be honest. Tell them the real story. That will build confidence if you start hitting those dates.
I will also say this, because Jacob, you and I have talked about this, and Scott, you and I have too, is like, just be aware that if you're looking for companies to help you with that from an implementation, from a compliance, from a documentation standpoint, there's fewer and fewer of those that have availability, right? So, I mean, backlogs are growing. We're seeing it across every major partner that we work with from weeks to months. So just be aware that Scott's absolutely right. Have a POAM with dates, have something that you can show. And if you're looking for partners to work with, make sure you get in line with those as early as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh man, awesome. Really awesome questions coming in. So David said,
scooping.
curious about the scoping for 3.122, controlling public information. For example, would the Summit 7 YouTube channel be in scope for level 1 or level 2 assessment as the company pursues certification? Why or why not? So would the YouTube channel be a public-facing information system?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So we have to have a process internal to Summit 7 to ensure that we do not expose CUI through those channels. We have to make sure we're not exposing CUI through Facebook or through LinkedIn or what have you.
Website.
Right. And so we have blogs, so we have a review process where our blogs, our content goes through that review process to ensure that we are not exposing CUI. This is really interesting that this question came up because I was very uncomfortable when Daniel brought that Army slide up. I realized that I was very, very uncomfortable because I know that was put out on a public webinar yesterday, right?
Yeah.
The Army put that out on a public webinar, but that thing is marked CUI. And we just had it on our on our
We
show
did.
here, and that scares the crap out of me. So, because I'm risk averse, right?
That's fair.
But so if this webinar never gets posted, or if this session never gets posted,
Yeah,
Yeah, that's right. You're just gonna cut out my section.
That's
this
gonna be
is
why.
deleted as soon as we
That's
hang
right.
up. This
See
one's
y'all.
offline. Now,
So-
an interest. Oh yeah, keep going, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, because we have to have that process. That process is more difficult when you're live, right? So you've got to be really careful about making sure that things beforehand, you know what you're going to be talking about, and you're not going to expose CUI. But yes.
Whoa.
So anyway, I digress.
So the interesting thing about 3.122, if I'm recalling correctly, it's been a minute since I looked at the specific assessment objectives for it, but I believe that if you look at the corresponding 853 control that is used to derive 3.1.22, it has never made sense to me why they tailored some of the objectives out and not others.
They should
because the way that the way that the 853 control is evaluated is that you have a process for checking before data is put in publicly accessible resources, and you have a resource for checking afterwards periodically that to make sure that there wasn't any data that isn't supposed to be in those systems. When they derived the 3.1.22 control, if I'm remembering correctly, they took the pre-check out, but they left the post-check in, which seems to completely remove the more important part is that you don't have to check before you post it, but you do have to check after it's up. So maybe that'll make you feel better, Scott. We can show all the CUI as long as we check afterwards that it's gone away. So it's never made that tailoring has never made sense to me in the revision. Maybe they'll fix it one day, but I just always thought if you were going to keep one of them, you would probably keep the first one, not the second one. All righty. Okay, cloud service providers that aren't FedRAMP authorized aren't going to have a customer responsibility matrix. Does the CSP need to create a CRM to include all CMMC security requirements accounted for? And does the CSP need to be compliant with CMMC but not certified? Daniel, our favorite issue here, CSPs and CMMC rather than CSPs and FedRAMP.
Yeah, so CSPs, and again, one major piece of context here is it going to process, store, transmit CUI? Because if it is going to process, store, transmit CUI, FedRAMP still applies. If you're not FedRAMP moderate, you have to be equivalent, which means you have to produce your full body of evidence. You have to go through no POAM, right, according to the DoD memo from January. So it's a lot more aggressive. Like you have to meet all of the requirements, like of FedRAMP moderate, hard stop. That's what it is. If you are a CSP that is not processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, and you're only providing security protection asset type services that would result in security protection data, then yes, this customer responsibility matrix, client responsibility matrix, shared responsibility matrix, whatever you want to call it, would have to be presented and have to be integrated into the organization seeking certifications or seeking assessments, overall assessment themselves, right? So again, relevant controls of the SPAs as they apply to the organization seeking that certification or assessment, right? From your CSP responsibility matrix. So long story short, if it's CUI, you can't get around FedRAMP. Equivalent's harder than actually getting authorized, assuming you can get a sponsor. But if it's just security protection data, it is a lot lighter touch. Build your client responsibility matrix with the 320 assessment objectives from 171A and get your clients to agree on it, right? And that's going to be the hardest part of the whole thing because it goes back to what Scott was saying. You've got to deem what those relevant controls are for the security protection assets that you're providing them.
And everybody has to agree on that. So
and everyone's got to agree.
Hey Jacob, since you're not at home, you probably don't have your red light, your boop boop light, right?
Let me see here. Let's see if I can.
Oh, he's got something.
Yeah.
Somebody's staying on Holiday Inn Express. So.
so your boop boop light. So Dr. Ron Ross just posted just a couple of minutes ago. The 801.72 revision 3 has completed internal review and will be moving to Launchpad next week.
Okay.
All
Launchpad.
right.
Launchpad, I can't. We'd have to go back and look because he always uses the launchpad metaphor before
Yeah.
publication. We'll have to plot out how many days after he says launchpad before it comes out, if it's the same week or the week after.
Yeah,
so,
I think what I'm getting at is next week we're going to see it.
Yeah, I think next week is probably safe. I just shout out Ron Ross. Thank you for not publishing it the last week before our webinar. And shout out to the Office of the Federal Register for not publishing the FARS CUI rule the week of our webinar, because I need to sleep sometime.
Which we are expecting that maybe in November still, right? The FARS CUI.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
we could have the FARS CUI rule in 800-172 in the same week. So yeah, we're gonna have to get some. We're gonna have to get some more lights.
You better
sleep this weekend, Jacob. Sleep this weekend.
We need to set the CUI hotline absolutely. Shop. Start
you got to bank up. You got to bank up the sleep. That's how sleep works. Alrighty, Joe says we have to send CUI on disks, and to our understanding, the data needs to be encrypted before we burn it onto a disk. We use 7-zip, which is AES 256, but not FIPS. Is that considered equivalent or not? So in general, equivalent algorithms are not what the CUI protections are looking for. CUI protections prescribe FIPS validated encryption modules. And so if you're using encryption to protect the confidentiality of CUI at any point, then you need to go and Google the NIST CMVP program, the Cryptographic Module Validation Program. They have a database of validated crypto modules. Those are the solutions that you can use in various applications, technologies, whatever your use case is, to tell if you are using the proper validated modules or not. FIPS approved algorithms do not make the cut.
Yeah, and I will tell you that we use actual thumb drives that have FIPS, FIPS encryption on them. So those are actually a really good solution if you're looking at sending CUI on, external media. Those kinds of FIPS validated, external thumb drives are really good solution.
So I did find that WinZip has a FIPS enabled option if you buy their enterprise version. I haven't been able to find the same for 7-zip, but yeah, or standalone USB keys like Scott was saying that are self-encrypting.
Yeah, you're definitely going to want to check that in the CMVB program. I'm even having issues with Bluetooth right now. So the best I can do is a pink light, Scott.
Hey, there you go.
move my hand in front of it is for whoop whoop.
Flashing effects.
We'll get the lights working for next week for Ron here. So let's see here. Is there any guidance on CUI file metadata located in a cloud application, but is not where the actual CUI data is stored? While it does have the capability to store, process, or transmit CUI data, it's disabled. Could that effectively be considered out of scope or CRMA? Some very detailed scoping questions.
Yeah, that is a very detailed scoping question.
Is there guidance on CUI file metadata located in a cloud application, but it is not where the CUI data is stored? I don't know off the top of my head the interpretation for metadata associated with CUI files. I don't believe metadata for CUI files is CUI itself. My gut says that's not true. So at that point,
could potentially be SPD. Potentially.
Yeah, potentially. This is going to maybe take a little more noodling. Daniel, I don't know if anything jumps out to you on this one, but the file metadata wouldn't be CUI. So you've got more options for scoping at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, I'm leaning towards the same as Scott and Jacob. No CUI. The metadata. So security protection data can only be in use with security protection assets, the way that the pairing works in the scoping guidance. I think that would really lead you to probably that CRMA. I don't foresee it being a CUI asset unless the tooling is a security protection asset type functionality. I wouldn't consider that.
Unless it's the same asset. I mean,
unless it's on the same asset, you're right. CUI and SPA together.
If it's on a CUI asset, then it would still be CUI, even though the metadata itself is not CUI.
Yeah, and I think it, like you said, I think it depends on the nature of the metadata. You know, for instance, if you have like some file monitoring tool or something going on, and they're looking at the file metadata in a cloud app, then you're going to have SPD in the cloud at that point. So,
now,
yeah, definitely a more detailed scoping question for sure.
Yeah, if that cloud app, and this is where it gets a little interesting with clouds, is on the same, logical or physical network as other CUI assets, right? Which clouds can be a little hard to determine kind of where that flow is, then it would be a CRMA because that asset's sitting with CUI assets, right? It's joined, able to gain access to it. So if it's not, able to kind of sit on the same network in the sense of access, it would probably end up being out of scope. But I think CRMA would probably be your safest bet there.
All righty, so important alert here. So we'll have to pink light alert everybody. So we have a hotline question that came in, but the system is not perfect just yet. So hopefully we'll get it going next week. So I have a transcript of the question from the hotline from a senior project manager. We are in an enclave. How can we use Teams or SharePoint to share, collaborate with our third-party engineers? Daniel, you look at that's a I got a slide for that smile.
Yeah, yeah. So let me just pull one up because we just make PowerPoint slides around here. Part of it just thinks it could just be our job sometimes. All right, here we go. Here, let me do a little screen share here. This one doesn't have any marked CUI on it, Scott, so I think we're probably okay.
We're gonna have a drum roll sound effect every time we share our screens, just for
my Oura Ring thanks you for not not sending my heart rate.
Hey, as long as you review it afterwards, we're good, right?
That's right. All right. So what does this actually look like? So here's a slide of one of our solutions that we have called a managed CUI enclave. So right at the very top there, you're going to see a Gov cloud and like a commercial cloud. It could be a Gov cloud and a Gov cloud and an academic cloud. It doesn't necessarily really matter here, right? So Microsoft has this ability called cross-cloud collaboration, in which you can set up a trust between these two tenants, and you can chat with each other on Teams, join Teams channels, Teams groups, group chats, co-author SharePoint documents, OneDrive, etc. Right? So it's a really kind of higher level of collaboration, what they call B2B, between two tenants. Now, if you're saying like, what are my other options outside of SharePoint and Teams? There are in the marketplace in Azure Gov, like secure SFTP for file transfers in and out of Azure environments. If they're like larger or kind of non-traditional file types, like engineering files and things like that. But my recommendation to you would be talk to your client that you're trying to collaborate with and build a trust between them, a cross-cloud collaboration trust. That way you can have that seamless kind of integration there. Now, I say all this to say is, you obviously have to be careful around who you're allowing on each side and what you're exposing, because you don't want to expose CUI, of course, to a commercial cloud and things like that. So purview protection policies and identity and attribute-based access, all that's really important to make sure that you have set up right before you just build this bridge between a compliant cloud and a non-compliant cloud, if that is the case. But yeah, if you have questions on it, feel free to message me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to dive deeper into it with you.
Or call the hotline. That was officially our first hotline question. So we'll work on getting the audio uploaded for sure.
Fantastic.
All righty, let's see here. Rolling right along. Frankie said, thought I heard if a prime is required to have level 2 C3PAO assessment for a contract, then subs will be required as well. If they're sending you CUI data pursuant to the contract that required the C3PAO status, then yes, any sub receiving that same data under that same contract would need it as well. Because of the way that the world works, unfortunately, a lot of primes aren't going to say, well, this one contract requires it and this specific type of data requires it, but this one doesn't. So congratulations, all of you people over here. You can self-assess. Bad news, everybody over here, you got to get a third party to assess. They're just going to come out and say, we don't know when or if you're going to receive data underneath these third-party C3PAO requirement contracts. So everybody go get your level 2 C3PAO assessment. It's exactly what we've seen them say in recent interviews. Scott, we were talking about this on the webinar yesterday. In addition to the fact that if they do end up hoping that you can self-assess and then something does change in a solicitation, and they turn around and tell you need to go get a C3PAO assessment, there's not a lot of confidence in self-assessments. Weird. And they can't wait 6 or 10 months, maybe longer, for companies to get up and running if the solicitation time is so short that they need you to be ready to go now, right? This is why, Daniel, we've talked about on the show, we've talked about on the podcast many times, the PALT window, the procurement administrative lead time, is a key thing to know about what your customer is seeing. How long between solicitations that they're going to bid on and the awarding of the contract do you have? If it's 30 days, 60 days, you need to be done and certified before they ever even bid, which is why they're telling you now, go get certified. And we're still months away from the official rollout actually starting.
Well, and we saw this last week. Leidos came out, their CISO said, hey, like our teaming agreements, like our we're looking at this right now because we have to know who we can work with, right? Who we can partner with moving forward on contracts. Alfred just made a comment in there about FIPS compliant security around WinZip. You are absolutely right. FIPS validated is what you're going to have to look for, by the way. So I just wanted to make a clarifying statement there, which WinZip, it looks like, according to their website, uses the Windows cryptography modules to do that encryption, assuming FIPS is enabled on the Windows OS. But yeah, that's a really good call out because a lot of people think FIPS compliant and FIPS validated are the same thing. Little known fact, they are not. So it's a lot of vendor language that can get kind of confusing there.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, it's been an hour already, Scott. Thanks for stopping by. As always a fun time. If we didn't get a chance to get to your question, then we will queue it up for the next show. We do it every Friday, 1 p.m. Eastern. And we now have a hotline number that you can call.
We do.
It's scrolling across the bottom. You're going to see it on social media. You're going to see it on YouTube. It is a real phone number that you can call. We had a real person call and leave a message, and we had a transcript that we read on this stream today. It's a new step on the journey here for everybody. Look, Scott's
already calling
on the phone right now. Oh man, big stuff coming around. New 172 updates, FARS CUI rule coming out. There's a bunch of stuff that's going to be happening. So you can find us on YouTube. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can find us streaming live every week. We have a podcast that comes out every week. Tons and tons of ways to get a hold of us. So everybody check that out. Shout out to Holiday Inn Express Livermore for this delightful facility and wonderful Wi-Fi. Marriott, we're going to have a conversation via Yelp as soon as I get off of this call. So there we go. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to try and play this outro, and hopefully I don't have any more technical difficulties. We'll see you next week.
See y'all later.